Okay, as long as I've got you guys confirming that it's all okay, that's fine with me, not a problem. So what we'll do is we'll make a start. Today we're looking at starting obviously a new unit. And this new unit is going to be called Managing Resources or Resource Management, essentially. It's a common unit between business and healthcare, and it's one of the optional units for you, Sumit, and for Eunice and Maria. So we are going to be looking at doing a quick bit of unit introduction before I go into the detailing as we discuss this particular, start of this particular unit and the learning outcome one. What I will also do at the same time is going to be able to share, my screen, because we're going to be using PowerPoint presentation and maybe a few videos to be able to cover through some of the contents of this unit. And the idea would be to, have an interactive discussion. My name is Raman Singh, and obviously I'm one of your lecturers, and I'll be teaching about 3 or 4 units, most of the main units in health and social care, and also some of the units now in business. So Sumit, you add some delivery with Shazia, I think with Anjum, but most of the delivery now for the remaining, I think 4 or 5 units is going to be with me. And the same case will be for Eunice and Maria. What I will also do at some stage would be during the session, show you the resources up on Moodle. As we go along, I will update some of the stuff in terms of presentation, books, handouts on Moodle as well. And that would be helpful for you, hopefully, a bit later when we start discussing, the assignment. So I've pretty much got most of you who have joined, but I'm missing 1 or 2. And I'm going to quickly message them just to make sure, that they are able to join. And what I would suggest is, if you're not asking any questions, just keep the background noise to the minimum by muting yourself. When you are asking questions, you can unmute the microphone so that, obviously, you can ask me questions or queries that you have at any given point in time. So let's make a quick start now. We are looking at about 45 minutes for the first session. Keeping in mind, I'll look at doing a bit of a unit introduction as well. What you see on your screen right now is basically the unit specification of the unit. This is something that we use as lecturers to be able to prepare presentation material, and also gives us a bit of a guidance from the awarding body in terms of what is to be taught in this particular unit. Now, managing resources or resource management is an important unit. When you look at working within a particular setup, what you're looking at in that setup is how does the, key people, or when I say key people in terms of management, how do they organize, resources for the usage of, by, let's say, for the business and also by staff and employees. So when we look at the term resource management, here the main focus primarily in health and social care and business sectors would be to look at human resources, because without people, we cannot do tasks. And it is the people within the organization or the business or the setup in health and social care which basically look at, carrying out most of the activities. So when we talk about resources, there are different types of resources. You have administrative resources, you have financial resources, you have physical resources, you have information related resources, and there could be other types of resources that the business, the care home, NHS, or in some cases, organizations would require. But one of the key resources that you normally see, plant and machinery, for example, if it's in the medical sector, it could be machines like CT scanner, X-ray machine, beds, oxygen, plants, things like that. It could be, wheelchairs. In the office, it could be things like, tea and coffee machine, vending machine, your printer, photocopier, things like that. These are all examples of resources. Now, when we look at resources in general, we would look at classifying them under different types. But the main focus on studying this particular unit is looking at human resources, and human and physical resources, which are basically needed in all organizations to be able to carry out any task and functions. Now, these resources would vary depending on the type of sector the business or the organization is operating in. So if it is a manufacturing organization, if it's an engineering organization, most of the resources, or production organization, most of the resources are going to be related to machines, robots, factory setup, infrastructural wise. And these would be warehousing facilities. These would be the resources which would be related to that sector. But if I look at services business, if, for example, we look at a call center business or a business which is providing services to customers, their resources might be PC, software dialing. Most of it, 80% will be human resources, because people will be on the back of the phone, receiving calls, making the calls, speaking to customers. And in those cases, you'll have more focus on, what the training and development on these, people and staff can be done in order to effectively deliver services or help customers solve their problems using telesupport. Similarly, if I look at healthcare, it would be a case wherein, if I just imagine a hospital, there are lots of different types of resources in a hospital, and these resources would include physical infrastructure, medical equipment. There would be obviously nurses, doctors, staff, health and social care workers, patients. There would be other types of resources which would be utilized by other staff, patients, or workers, and they could be things like you have canteen, pantry facilities, you have wheelchairs, beds, plethora of things which could be utilized in providing care to the patients who are coming into the hospital. Now, here, our focus would remain managing resources, which is human, and also looking at physical resources, specifically tackling technology and infrastructure related resources. Now, the reason why we study this particular unit is, if I give you a context, when we are working within a business organization or a business or an organization, and you work within the company in a particular role, you would need certain bits of, let's say, embodiments to be able to work effectively. Things like a telephone, a laptop. In some cases, if you're working in sales, maybe the company might provide you a car. And these are basic resources that you would need to be able to reach out to your customers and get business. If I look at it from a context of healthcare, these resources would typically mean that you need adequate training. If you work as a nurse, as a care worker, as a health and social care worker, as any sort of a health and social care practitioner, like a physiotherapist, a nutritionist, an occupational therapist, you would need training, and you would have skills in terms of your previous background, in terms of academic and experience, which would allow you to step into that role. Now, here, if you look at a physiotherapist, you would need access to resources, physical resources like wheelchairs, trolleys, and things like that, which will be used in terms of providing exercises or giving routine, instructions to patients who are recovering from, say, accidents and other things. If they've undergone some sort of a surgical treatment, then in those cases, your role would be to help get the patient back on their feet. And in this case, you would need physical resources. You would need maybe a training room. You would need essentially resources like, push cars, trolleys, wheelchairs, and crutches and other bits. I'm just thinking aloud, but there could be lots of different types of things that you would need to be able to help your patients essentially get back on their feet. And these are the kind of resources that you would be needing within a health and social care setup. So in general, this is quite important, is because if you don't have these as embodiments to be able to offer your services, there is no way that you can offer any service to either a patient, a customer, or, say, for example, when you work within an organization, you won't be able to do your role and responsibility effectively or properly. So in those cases, it is very important for us to understand what are these resources, how do we manage them, how do we control them, and how do they help us in running or doing and discharging our day-to-day functions within a particular role or a responsibility that you work with. Now, with this particular background in terms of the overall unit, there are 4 learning outcomes that we would need to cover. And these 4 learning outcomes, we'll do 4 sessions. So today we are going to look at learning outcome 1. Tomorrow will be learning outcome 2. Now, some part of this particular unit is more focused on the let's say the business side of things, in the sense that you need to learn about resources, because here I wouldn't be able to look at contextualizing whether we are looking at resources for a particular sector. So if I talk about construction, or if I talk about engineering, I talk about healthcare, I talk about business or services, financial services, these are all different sectors, manufacturing, agriculture. But what we are going to look at is broadly, we'll be looking at covering what is resource management, what is the role of a manager, what is the role of when you work within an organization, what is your role in effectively, kind of controlling, working, and ensuring that the delivery that you do in terms of your output is basically you optimizing or basically using optimized resources to be able to deliver and achieve the goals and objectives which have been set by your managers or by the organization. So in some cases, you would look at these resources being accessible. You look at these resources being well maintained. That means they go through some sort of a servicing, or they are looked at from a point of view of giving some sort of for a vehicle we do an MOT. So it is something which is like well maintained, and then it is something which is ready to be used as and when required, for the purposes of delivering a particular service to a customer or a patient, or, in some cases, even looking at being utilized by yourself, because that would be required for you to do your work. Now, imagine a situation, just a literal example that I would say, you are required to send an email to your customer. Now, if you don't have access to a PC, or if you don't have an email account when you work within the organization, how would you send an email across? So this would mean that you need a resource, which is an IT resource like computer or a PC. And using the computer or PC or a Mac, whichever your organization is given and has provided, you would be able to then send across these emails, communicate with your customers, and that is what would be required. If I look at from a point of view of health and social care, just as an example, there are nurses which basically go and give, medication to patients from time to time during the course of the day. They normally seem to carry a phone or a smartphone in their hands. The first thing that they would normally do is when they go to the patient, you would normally, in the olden days, if I look at without technology, in the olden days, you would carry a slip or a pad which would say this medication has to be delivered to the patient. And you would make sure that this is the same right medicine or right formula, and then right, in terms of its context of what has been prescribed. And then you would administer the medicine. Today, using technology, you normally would see a nurse carrying a smartphone. First thing they would do is scan the tag of the patient, and the medication that the patient has to receive would come automatically be shown on the screen. And that is where things have been streamlined over the years with the use of technology to make resource utilization more efficient and more optimal for the purposes of what is being used for. So it helps us deliver high quality service and also makes the workforce competent. And we'll be looking at some of these through examples as we go along in the study of this particular unit. Today's discussion will be centered around looking at understanding the key features of resource management, which is learning outcome 1 here. And that would have 2 assessment criteria. So a bit of a trip down the memory lane, in the sense that we would need to look at building our knowledge in terms of understanding what are the different sectors of economy. Although some of us understand that, business is one sector, but if I look at classification of sectors, essentially from a point of view of economy, classification of sectors is normally done. There are about 16 different sectors in a particular economy. And this is where what we will need to do is understand and build our knowledge when we talk about sectors. So we have primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector, which is one way wherein you classify what kind of output the companies produce. And we'll go into a bit of detail on this. And then we will look at within these sectors, what are the different types of businesses or organizations which normally provide services to consumers or, essentially to people, and where do people work within these sectors. The second part, we are looking at outlining key requirements of relevant resource management. That means here we are going to be looking at essentially understanding what are the key organizations which work and make up these sectors in the economy. And that is where, when I talk about healthcare, that is one that is classified as one major sector. So in most countries, when we look at, and in most economies, when we look at, you would generally see a Department of Health, or Ministry of Health and Welfare, or Ministry of Health and Social Care, a Department of Health and Social Care, and that would be classed as one of the sectors. So when we talk about education, that is one of the sector. When we talk about defense, that is one of the sectors. When we talk about shipping, manufacturing, that is one of the sectors. When we talk about construction, that is one of the sectors. We talk about retailing, that is one of the sectors. So what we would do in the first learning outcome would be to broadly understand these 2 assessment criteria. And if I look at what is the indicative content that we need to cover, for first learning outcome. We'll be covering some of these in our discussion, this part here in our discussion with regards to the, learning outcome 1, which basically focuses on understanding the key features of resource management. So let's get into, the presentation, which would allow us to maybe discuss this in a bit more detail. And let me share this presentation slide. So when we look at, I hope you're able to see the slide. You can always give me a thumbs up through the chat route, or essentially, unmute your mic for a second or two, and then let me know that you're able to see these slides and obviously hear me okay. Now, obviously, this session is being recorded, so you'll have a copy of this recording available to you just after the session as well. And should you need to revisit, thank you, Maria. Should you need to revisit this, that can be done pretty much just after the session. So the main aim of this unit that I mentioned to you earlier is to understand human and physical resources. Obviously, as I mentioned, there are lots of different types of resources, but we're going to be focused on understanding how human resource, which is very critical to any organization, whether we look at the NHS, 244,000 people work within the NHS. If I look at any major company or an organization like Microsoft or Dell, or if I look at Apple, there are over 300,000 people which work within the organization. One of the key things which the organization needs is human resource. That means people who will carry out functions or carry roles and responsibilities. And these responsibilities would mean that they would need to, carry out certain functions on a day-to-day basis for the organizations to function. Similar is the case with the NHS. And then the idea is to understand how does management part of it develop over a point in time when they know they have resources. Like you have money is also a resource, financial resource. So when you have financial resources, administrative resources, physical infrastructure resources, plant equipment and machinery, and you have human resources, how does the management then create a mix which allows them to ensure that the utilization of these resources is bringing efficiency and productivity within the organization? That means effectively they are able to discharge their duties, or their roles and responsibilities effectively. And how does that happen? So we'll understand that in subsequent learning outcomes. And then we need to be in a position, obviously, at some stage in your life and your careers, you guys will move into management. That means you'll have supervisory responsibility. You'll manage maybe other employees or other staff within the organization as you have experience and you grow within your careers. So at some stage, you need to have a broader understanding on and knowledge of how to effectively put these resources which are given to you at your disposal as a manager. How do you put them to use effectively and use these resources to get tasks done, to fulfill objectives within the organization? So these are the bits that we would look at in this particular unit when you study the whole unit as terms of resource management. Now, this is the indicative content that we are looking at covering, which is coming from the unit spec in the first learning outcome, which is understanding resource management, and we'll get into this in a bit more detail. Now, if I look at, I've given you some examples of what is resource management already, but if I look at because one of the other aspects that we need to throw into the mix is to try and understand what is economy and what are the various sectors in economy. Now, this is maybe a trip down memory lane in terms of some of us who have studied, social sciences, or maybe in our schooling days, understood and had some context and relevance to economy. Now, when you talk about economy, economy is basically, the main engine of, the country, essentially. So when we talk about economy, it talks about, basics of, let's say, a system which basically consists of production, distribution, and consumption of goods. So goods and services in a particular region or in a particular country. And that would constitute economy. So all the activities, if I look at home, just to give you an example, there are lots of different people in the home, and you have, so for example, you, your husband, your kids, maybe your parents. Everyone does and carries out different functions, and that makes the home work. That means somebody is responsible for, let's say, working and bringing home salary. Somebody is responsible for cooking. Somebody is responsible for washing. But what effectively is happening within the home is that there are people who are having different roles and responsibilities, and what they're doing is essentially working on those roles and responsibility to keep the home running. If you look at a hospital, you have nurses, doctors, practitioners, therapists, care workers, administrators, practice managers, you have consultants, you have administrative people, security. They are all managing different sides of the functions to keep the hospital running. Now, if we expand that as a concept and talk about a country in terms of what are the various activities which are happening in the country, which are keeping the country running, or a region within a city or a country running, then we will be looking at talking about the economy. So here, things like production of goods, distribution of goods, consumption of goods and services will all constitute what is basically a combination of activities which is happening, and that would basically be carried out by individuals, by businesses, by government, by various other organizations, and that relates to some sort of transaction happening. Now, when we talk about economy, it will mean that we will need to look at understanding what are the various resources in the economy. That means you have labor, which is manpower, you have natural resources, you have technology, you have companies, organizations, which are producing goods and services, and these are being bought and sold, or bought and sold, manufactured, bought and sold by different sets of people within the organization. And this transaction of what is being done as a whole constitutes what is called the economy of a country. Now, the economy of the country at this stage, just understanding it fundamentally for the purposes of looking at putting in a bit of perspective is important here. So here, what I would say is that when we look at the components of economy, we are looking at things like production, consumption, distribution. You have exchange of goods and services, which will happen simply because people will not work for free. In return, they would want a salary. So what you'll generally see is that there will be employment, but in exchange for employment, people will do their roles, or they will carry out some functions, and in return they will get income or salary from the company or from the organization. And then the government plays a very important role because it intervenes and creates laws, legislation, which every organization or every part of the economy would need to follow. And these would then look at giving the government the levers to be able to tax, manage, regulate, and run the economy, or run the in this case a region or a city. Now, if I break this down and give you a smaller example, go back to a hospital. Now, in the hospital, there are different sets of people which are running various activities. Doctors, surgeons would be performing clinical operations. Nurses, healthcare workers would be helping the doctors run and do some of these operations, but after that, they'll also be looking at care and providing care to the patients. There'll be an administrative team, cleaners, janitors, people who work as porters or, chaperones. They would essentially be taking patients' beds or, infrastructure from one place to the other. Their role would be to keep the hospital running. You have practice managers, you have consultants, you have administrative staff, you have security, and they will all play their part in terms of their role and discharge their duties to be able to help run that place smoothly, or with without any problems or without any interruptions. And that bit that you would see is being done in an organization, in a business, in a particular place or a setup, and that would constitute, maybe running of that particular location. Now, if I relate this to the word economy, now obviously in hospital you are not looking at economy, but you would see various uses of the word economy happening at different levels by the management. One would be, can we make economic use of resources? That means, can we reduce the waste? Can we reduce the linen being sent out, or can we reduce certain parts of waste which is going out from or being used in the hospital? And that reduction in waste would mean saving of money, saving of time, or maybe saving the environment. And that would be looking at the economic side of things. They would be looking at in terms of salaries, in terms of number of people working, and obviously looking at economizing the output in terms of, this is the budget that we get from the government to run the hospital. This is the expense which is currently being spent. There is a delta. then the management would get into or step into and then obviously start looking at where they can optimize the working of resources in order to save money in places. And that would mean that what they get, they are living within those means in terms of, then being able to spend that money to run some of the operations of the hospital more effectively. And the same case would happen for the organization if it's a business. Now, with that understanding, if we look at economy, just for understanding reasons, there are 4 sectors in the economy. You have primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Now, these are classifications which typically, are done on the basis of, what kind of, goods and services do the organizations actually produce when we talk about various sectors. So when we talk about primary, just for understanding reasons, primary, as the word means, primary, it would mean a set of activities which companies or organizations carry out wherein they are actually producing goods from natural resources or raw material. That means from the Mother Earth. So when you look at an iron mining company, when you look at a coal mining company, when you look at a company which is generating power from water, a hydroelectric dam, for example, when we talk about, or we talk about companies which are essentially mining diamonds from mines. These are companies which are basically involved in primary activities. And these primary activities would include, say, for example, farmers growing crops. Is a primary activity because those crops at some stage would be then sold in the market. They'll be picked. The fruits will be picked. They'll be cleaned, transported to a market, and then somebody will buy. But the activities which are basically using natural resources would be termed as primary sector of the economy. Things like agriculture, forestry, fishing, mining, extraction of oil, for example. These companies like Shell, BP, Texaco, they would be involved in providing primary services to the economy. So they are classed as, because they are working with natural resources and they convert natural resources into products and services. What is secondary sector? Secondary sector would be, companies, organizations which are transforming this raw material into finished goods. So some companies will extract diamonds or extract oil, but that oil cannot be put into the car. So it will go into a part of the refinery, and there the refining of this product, which is crude oil, as we say, will be done to produce diesel, petroleum, other sorts of products that we use as household cleaning products. They would be then classed as secondary sector, or organizations working within that side of things within the economy would be termed as working within the secondary sector. Look at construction. So when you look at construction companies, they buy raw material like bricks, heights, and other things which are required to construct houses, but they are not making them. They are using them to construct and create a finished product like a house. And that is why they will be termed as secondary companies, because they are buying products and services from primary companies or sectors of the economy wherein they are being produced, and they are utilizing them to create finished products. A tertiary sector would be a sector which will be utilizing and providing a service. So once the house is constructed, just as an example, staying with the house, then a lettings agency or a marketing agency would start selling that product or start advertising the new development to clientele in that area. And in terms to their aim would be to secure the sale of these residential properties. So when we look at activities or economic activities that provide services rather than producing tangible goods, they would be companies or organizations then working within the tertiary sector. Now, in addition to this, we also have quaternary sector. So quaternary means that the companies or organizations involved will be looking at carrying out activities which are going to be more of, management and information related. That means they would look at research and development. They would look at consultancy. They would be looking at basically providing knowledge to any of these companies or organizations working in the 3 sectors, primary, secondary, or tertiary, and they would be termed as companies or organizations offering services to any of the 3 of these primary sectors, and they would be classed under quaternary sector. So let me ask you this question. If I look at the NHS, National Health Service, which sector do you think the NHS would fall under? Will it be primary, secondary, tertiary, or quaternary? And if I talk about a company like Microsoft, or if I talk about a company like NVIDIA, which is producing chips for phones and TVs and stuff, where do you think the classification of that type of a company would fall under when we look at these four types of sectors? Any ideas? So whether National Health Service or hospital will fall under a primary, secondary, tertiary, which sector would it fall under? And if a company, if I take an example like a business, NVIDIA, or so say take Microsoft or Apple, where would they fall under in terms of a classification when we talk about which type of sector or within the economy these companies work in or these departments work in? Then you're looking at NHS would be secondary or maybe tertiary in this case, because they are providing services like care, and obviously they are providing services which are basically delivering integrated care to patients. So when you have a broken arm or if you have had a fracture, then you go to the hospital, and obviously there are going to be services which will be provided, things like a plaster, medication, treatment, physiotherapy, and they would essentially be classed as providing services to the patient. And when we talk about companies like Microsoft, they could both be classed into primary and secondary, because if I look at, just as an example, Microsoft produces Xbox, which is a gaming console. That gaming console is then used to basically sell a lot of services, and that would mean they could fall into both primary, secondary, and tertiary sector, depending on the products that we choose from that particular organization. But in general, they would be classed as a company which is primarily, in, I would say, tertiary sector, because most of the products they produce are software related, and these software related products essentially help other organizations do economic activities. You use Microsoft Word or Microsoft Office to be able to create documents. You use maybe Hotmail to be able to send an email. And these are the kind of activities which, the company would be classed on basis what is the core function and services they actually provide. Now, just very clearly, just to look at also putting into context, when we look at resource and when we look at resource management, what we are looking at is, when you classify resource, all companies would look at, tallying this with four different parts of their workings within the organization. One would be, what is the mission of the organization? What are the objectives they want to fulfill? What are the strategies or plans that the organization has to be able to provide these services? And then in some cases, when I use the word tactics, what I mean by that, what are the specific things that they're going to do in order to react to competition or provide these services at a more competitive rate, or look at making sure that they are doing or providing their services which are basically helping in getting certain specific jobs done. And that would be the concept which will be applied to resource in general. So if I look at a phone, and if I need to provide this as a device to a salesperson within the organization, what would be the purpose of providing the phone will come under mission. What are the objectives the phone will be able to fulfill? What would be the main reason why a smartphone needs to be given as against a normal phone to an employee? And then in some cases, what would be the specific functions which the phone would help do to the sales employee if they are providing, if the company or the organization is providing that phone. So the bits can be clearly segregated, and what the phone will allow the customer to, the employee to do is get in touch with customers while he's on the move, not in the office. So he's not fixed to a landline. The phone would allow him or her to do other functions, things like emailing, quick text messages, responding to phone calls, and then providing a normal phone versus a smartphone would make sense, is because that is where the company would say, okay, I only want the employee to be able to receive calls and make voice-based calls. But in some cases, some companies would say, okay, when they go to the client's or client's location, a smartphone would be much more essential because they'll be able to use it for demonstration, for maybe showcasing certain things, replying to email, and that would increase productivity. And that is where strategy comes in. So when you look at planning for resources, you put these four things in mind, which is mission, objective, strategy, and what it is being employed for in terms of tactics. Now, give you a simple example, which is covering resource management as an overall perspective. Now, this slide gives you an example of what would be resource management when we talk about in terms of processes, in terms of sectors. Now, if you look at farmers which produce milk, just as an example, or if you look at people or companies or organizations which are basically manufacturing equipment, what would they do essentially in terms of, how would they produce this first? So, for example, if I look at agriculture, people who are doing farming, and if they are involved in the milk and milk products industry, they would normally have a lot of cows and cattle, or, essentially to be able to, farm milk from them. And that would mean that they are using natural resources to be able to get the product which they would finally transfer to a company like Tesco, Morrison's, ASDA, and they would then process it further and then sell it to consumers from their, grocery stores or from their retail stores. So when you look at these companies, this type of operation, what we are looking at is some part of the people working within the economy would be involved in working and getting these products, and they would become then input for some of the other industries or companies or organizations in that area, and they would use it as one of the products to be able to create a finished product. So getting milk or milking the cows would not just be the case wherein they would only be able to get milk, but when that is stored in containers, it has to be bottled, pasteurized, processed, and then labeled, and then it reaches supermarkets to be able to be bought by consumers. You would see that one part of the business is acting as providing input. That input is being worked on to produce an output, a finished product, and that is being sold to the consumer. So here, when we talk about resources, some point in time you would see that there is a transformation process which applies when input makes with processes gives a particular output, and that output means a finished product that you would need to be able to sell to consumers. So this example on the slide here talks about resource management as a process of transformation, because having a phone or having employees or having resources, physical resources, financial resources would not be enough. You'll have to work with them to be able to create an output, and that output is what would be then driving either your goals and objectives or at least the aims and objectives required for the organization. So having the beds and having the, say for example, infrastructure within a hospital would not cut it. You would need trained staff. You would need, obviously, technicians, people who are essentially trained to be able to use those resources. Like an X-ray machine, you would need a radiographer who knows how to use the machine, how to provide the output, and then that output is then used by the doctor to see where the bone fracture is or where the the bone is broken, and then appropriate treatment is prescribed. So some part of this, as the process works as input with processes being applied, that means further work being done, and then that produces an output. So milk, in terms of farmers producing milk, finally the finished product is ice cream or cream or butter. You would see there is a process of transformation which applies, and that is what sometimes helps classify the companies and organizations which work within the economy into primary, secondary, tertiary sector. Is that clear? Is that okay so far?
Yes.
Okay, so let's look at some of the assessment criteria now. In terms of what we are looking at understanding is what are the various assessment criteria in learning outcome 1. The first one talks about analyzing different resources and requirements of organizations in different sectors of economy. So when we talk about resources, as I mentioned to you earlier, we could classify resource under different types: raw material, equipment, manpower, technology, facilities. Time is also a resource, and financial resources. You could look at equipment and machinery, and this is what the classification of resources essentially would be. Now, if I need to look at figuring out and basically differentiating between these different types of resources and how they work and how the company's organizations or a particular sector utilizes them in the economy, what I've done is I've used a table to basically explain that. Now, imagine and most of you on the session today, let's look at four of you, and including me, let's wear four different hats. Let's assume four different roles. I'm assuming the role of an investor. Somebody assumes the role of a customer. Somebody assumes the role of an employee. Somebody assumes the role of an organization, or somebody who's a manufacturer. There could be other roles as well, but just looking at, if I assume the role of an investor, what would my interest in a particular organization be? My interest in that organization would be, at some stage, what is the turnover of the organization, what the organization is producing in terms of profits, how much revenue is it generating, and what is the bonus or the dividend at the end of the day I would get because I am an owner, part owner, because I own shares of the company. If you are a worker within the organization, if you work as an employee or a staff, what would be your main aspects that you would be considering when you work for a company or an organization? Assuming some of you, Sumit, you can assume that you are working within a business. Maria and Eunice, you can assume that you work within the NHS. So what would be your perspective on interest in terms of when you work within the role within the organization? What do you think it will be?
As an investor?
No, in your case, say as an employee within the organization.
Didn't get your question.
Okay. What we want to do in this task is to understand what are the different resources that organization or businesses would need, assuming a particular role that you take up and when you work within a company or an organization. So if I work within a business, or if I say, for example, work within a company like Microsoft and I work as a sales manager, what would be the resources that you would need to effectively and completely do your job well? And for Maria and Eunice, if you look at working within the NHS or a care home and you work as an employee, what kind of resources do you think you would need to be able to effectively discharge your duties?
As a sales manager, we'll need a products for sale.
Yes.
Material.
Correct.
To manufacture.
So if I steer you,
just need a products for sale.
Correct. So if I steer you in that direction to narrow it down, assuming you work as a sales manager, and what you mentioned was you need the source in terms of material. So here you might want to look at saying that I might need training and development for what the product and the services provide and how they benefit the customer. So one part of the aspect could be that you need training and development to understand what are the products and services and what are the usage of those products and services for customers that you're going to sell. Then you look at physical resources that you need to be able to sell. Things like you might need access to a PC, you might need access to an office, you might need access to certain physical infrastructure, things like a telephone line, you mentioned broadband or internet. So they would be required for you to...
For delivery.
Correct. And if you are involved in field sales, you want to you travel and meet customers, you give obviously demonstrations of certain type of products to customers, then you would also need obviously elements of things like how to travel, whether it's a car, whether it's a company provided transport, and they would be required for you to do your job effectively. If I look at it from a point of view of, say, medical representative, somebody who's a medical rep, medical reps go to doctors, they talk about medications, show demos, give samples. They would have certain types of resources that they would use to be able to do their job effectively. If I look at somebody who works within a hospital, if you're a nurse or if you're a health and social care assistant, you would probably have some qualification and training which would allow you to work. But in addition to that, you would need instruments like, okay, you routinely check blood pressure, blood sugar, you check, oxygen level, or you provide care to patients within a particular, let's say, ward within the hospital, say a cardiac ward, or for example, you work within a particular ward which cares for patient. So in this case, you would need training on equipment which you would be required to use. You would also then be competent in using that equipment to record, accurate statements of blood pressure, maybe oxygen level, pulse rate, And, if you are also testing, say, patients with blood sugar, their blood sugar in terms of if they are diabetic or not, then you should be able to read some of the, let's say, the output which the machine or the equipment is providing, and then appropriately note it down in terms of recording it. And that would be the case wherein you're looking at different resources being utilized in your role, because your role is very specific when you work within a particular organization. And with that role in mind, you're requiring specific resources which will allow you to effectively work and discharge your responsibilities. Now, we could basically further look at classifying this as public and private. So when we look at ownership of organizations, this is something that you need to also understand, that when we talk about organizations within the economy, we normally classify them into 4 or 5 types. I've only mentioned here private and public sectors, but you also have charity, you have non-for-profit, and you have cooperatives or other types of setups which basically also function and provide services within the broader set of sectors of economy. So when we look at a charity is a non-for-profit organization which is going to provide services or carry out certain functions which are primarily going to be for the greater good of the public, or in some cases they will receive money, resource in terms of any sort of resources required, and they might come across from raising funds through speaking to people, or essentially some part of it is going to be also subsidized and coming from the government. So when we look at charities like Oxfam in the UK, we look at lots of other charities, Cancer Charity, Macmillan, some of these charities, they create or they get funds from members of public. They ask for donations, but also they are essentially, using this money for only providing services. They are not making any profits out of it. But when we talk about private sector and public sector, what we are looking at is public sector, the sector wherein the services, the output, and the salaries and the wages and the resources are paid for or provided by the government. And that is why it is public. It is owned by the government and it is owned by the taxpayer, and that is why it's termed as public. When we talk about private sector, that means the ownership of the company or the organization is in private hands. That means private organizations which are primarily looking at making profits by offering those products and services to consumers or people in the market. Now, in the UK, when I talk about the medical sector, healthcare and health sector or Department of Health, it is publicly funded. NHS gets funding from the government, and there is obviously there are private players in the market. You look at Spiral, you look at Bupa. There are lots of other different organizations which are private sector, which are owned privately. They provide services, and people can also go to the private sector to get services in healthcare. But generally, citizens of the UK, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, they are able to get free health and medical services from the National Health Service, because this is one of the basic pretexts of welfare state. That means UK is a welfare state, so housing, schooling, you look at medical health services, and if you're out of job or things like that, universal credit, these are services which are provided by the government. So they are under public sector, and the ownership is by the government or the members of public, you and me as citizens of the UK, or somebody who's settled in the UK. And when we talk about private sector, they basically are owned by companies or individuals or venture capitalist firms, but essentially have ownership which has got nothing to do with the government or members of public. If the organization wants to go public, they would list the company on a stock exchange. Then the members of public are offered shares. When you buy shares, you have a part ownership or partial ownership of the company. But generally, these companies are looking at generating profits. Public sector companies are providing services, defense, for example, healthcare, for example. These are services which the government is not looking at making any profit. They are required to be provided in order to sustain and keep the economy running. And in those cases, you would see them as public sector. Now, when we talk about different types of resources, what I've done in order to cover this assessment criteria and understand what are the differences between different types of resources. So we have to look at differing resources in different types of the organizations. What I've done is I've created detailed slides to cover each of these resources. So when we talk about physical resource, that means it's a tangible resource. So when I say you buy fruit and veg, you actually can touch fruit and veg. But if I say I take or provide, call center services, or I provide services in terms of support through the internet, you're not physically touching any product. There's no physical product or exchange of physical product involved here. When you administer medicine, in the hospital, you are looking at a physical product because the medication is prescribed in the form of a tablet, a gel, a liquid, and that is given to the patient. But that would be still classified as a physical resource because the applicability and the availability of the medicine has to be done depending on what treatment is being offered to the patient. So in those cases, anything that you are able to touch, feel, and you use and then provide services through it would be classed under physical resources. Materials are also physical resources. They would be equipment that you use, like for example, how do you measure blood pressure for a patient? You need to use a blood pressure monitor. If I talk an example of let's say looking at oxygen levels in a patient, if they are requiring any breathing equipment, you would normally use an oximeter to measure the oxygen levels in the blood. And then if they are, not able to breathe naturally, then, you would normally provide them, breathing through, say, for example, assisted breathing, which will come through one of the equipments, or nebulizer or things like that. If I look at organizations, you would normally look at material. So, for example, if a customer is paying, for a certain goods and services, for example, just as a simple case, you run a plumbing agency or an electric agency, and you get a call from the customer that this is not working, my washing machine is not working. So the customer then gets a visit from an engineer, and that engineer would normally look at where is the fault and then look at rectifying the fault. So in those cases, they will basically make use of some materials. For example, a pipe needs to be changed or something has to be, fixed in terms of a faulty equipment. And that is where they would use material. They might have to break open and then, obviously, when I say break open, if it is internal piping or, things like that, they might have to look at changing some parts of it, and that would require material for it to be rectified. And that would be classed under physical resources. Buildings and facilities would also come under physical resources. So is this okay? Any questions on the first learning outcome, first assessment criteria?
No, sir.
Sorry. Now, the second assessment criteria talks about explaining the importance of resource management and how it is achieved. Now, in any organization, you would see budgeting is done. If I'm looking at running a hospital or any sort of a service, you are basically looking at, financial resources. And at some stage, the management in this case would be looking at doing an annual planning or some sort of a planning, which will be discussing annual requirements of financial resources, material resources, human manpower resources, which would be required to run the setup. Similarly, an organization would require the same. And when I look at that, this process of planning, which is required to be done, would be done, by the management or by somebody who has managerial responsibility, and this would require planning. So there would be a top-down approach that you would normally take. In the case of NHS, normally all hospitals or primary care trusts, PCCTs, they are normally provided annual budgets, and they have to then do budgetary planning to see whether they wouldn't be able to, provide services within those resources which have been provided. If they need additional budgets, they will need to create, additional paperwork or, proposals which will be sent to their primary care trust. And in those primary care trusts, the, management then would look at the situation, look at the patient numbers, the workload, the number of operations which are happening, things like that, so staffing requirements, and then either approve or, provide additional budgets. But this would mean some sort of a planning which has to be done. Now, whether that's top-down planning or, planning which is done. When I say top down means backward, and or in some cases it will be forward planning, and that would be required to be done to ensure that there is effective utilization of any sort of resource being done within the organization. Now, this has 5 steps. So first of all, you will have to look at what is the capacity. So in a sales organization, if the target is being set that we want to increase the turnover to 1 million, then there is a resource planning or capacity planning which will be done. Do we have enough sales managers? Do we have enough people to be able to get to that target? If I look at hospital, and if they are looking at, if it's a 500-bed hospital and their previous years show that they have more than 500 beds being occupied at any given point in time, then the hospital management would need to look at planning for increase in the hospital bed capacity. So what they are looking at essentially is why the lead times are more, why the ambulances have to wait, why the wait times are higher, or why there is a low satisfaction index, when we receive feedback, it is poor feedback from patients because the services are taking longer time. So this all will be taken into consideration by the management while they do planning, from a point of view of looking at capacity of what they can handle and what they can offer. Then it goes into resource allocation. Then it goes breaking down further into, what are the key competencies and, key areas which require these resources. So in some cases, there could be adequate staff, but the staff is not trained enough to be able to deliver those services. And that could be the same case in an organization. If you're working as a sales manager, a lot of organizations put people and staff through lots of trainings annually, because if there's a new introduction of a product, new technology, something that the organization is transitioning from, then people would need training to be able to optimally and effectively use that product or that service and then gain the advantage, which is why the organization is employing it. A simple example that I would give you here is if the accounts in the organization is all done manually by sending emails, drawing up invoices, but at some stage the organization's business is increasing, and what they have started to do now is the management has approved the installation of an let's say a subscription-based, cloud-based accounting system. Now that would mean that accounting invoices could be opened to sales managers, but obviously they could invoice to their own customers. And in the back end, the finance manager could keep track of these invoices and, keep doing follow-ups as and when the invoices are received to close them. But if the adequate training is not given, then this system would still not work. So efficiency comes into question, wherein we look at utilization of resources. Similarly, in a hospital, the hospital has all the equipment, new X-ray machines, new MRI scanners, new CT scanners, things like that. But the staff is not prepared and adequately trained to use that machine. Then one scan, which should normally take half an hour, the slots are taking 1 hour, 1.5 hours, because only 1 or 2 staff are trained. They know how to operate the machine well. And then in those cases, rescannings are not required because the first scan itself is quite effective, would make a lot of difference in terms of how resources are utilized. And when we look at big organizations, you would generally see that resource planning would also involve working on management, teamwork and management. And that is where the optimal utilization of resources will happen. Managers normally would try and group people in a team wherein they see skill sets and positives or advantages being added, wherein the team then is able to achieve an overall objective. So their aim is to put together a team with skills, knowledge, experience, background, and the ability to be able to carry out those functions, which would allow the goals and objectives of the organization to be, achieved. And then last but not the least, at some stage, what they will also need to plan is how do we review what is being put into practice. So there will be a very important role of, a review and personal workload management, which is to say that the job descriptions are, there's adequate staff. The staff has an adequate job description, and with the right job description, they have the right training, and they are able to perform their responsibilities to the best of their abilities, which would help the organization move forward. So in some cases, the organization will put incentives, rewards, to be able to motivate people. They will look at putting them into training. They would look at giving them higher responsibility. They would look at moving them into a different role, which they feel they have skill sets for. And all this will be done as a part of planning to ensure that the utilization of resources is done to the optimum level. And that is what is required to be covered in this particular assessment criteria, wherein we need to explain with an example of how resource management of resource is important and how this can be achieved within the organization. So generally speaking, I've explained the details of the working of top-down approach in few of these slides, which will be what I've explained in terms of understanding resource planning and management of that resource to be able to help the organization achieve its objective. Now, I've taken a few examples. For example, if you know that in the EU, all big stores, grocery stores or supermarkets have been asked to implement and create provisions to be able to produce their own electricity, reduce the amount of material going to landfill by 2027. Now, this is a European regulation which has been passed by the European Parliament, and all big supermarkets are required to have, they are looking at obviously ways to produce their own energy, manage their own waste, and obviously reducing the amount of waste going to landfill, thereby helping to conserve the environment. Now, the supermarkets which will not be able to employ and have this implemented by 2077 will have sanctions. That means their hours could be curtailed. They would be, looking at putting fines on certain of these organizations because they've not complied with the legislation. Now, in those cases, when we look at a specific objective of utilization of resource, which is to reduce waste, reduce cost in terms of electric or energy utilization, this is a key goal which you could use to explain this particular criteria, which is talking about, the resource management and how it can be achieved in a top-down approach. So a lot of companies and supermarkets are essentially now employing or upgrading their supermarkets and stores to employ solar panels. They are creating waste collection facilities and looking at, obviously recycling that waste to be able to generate energy within the facility itself, and that would make these stores self-sufficient as far as the utilization of energy and electricity and gas is concerned in terms of heating and lighting for the stores. And obviously, some part of it is being done by recycling the waste material within the supermarket as a plant or as a subset of the plant which is being set up in most supermarkets. And that ensures that any waste material which needs to go out to landfill can actually be not sent to landfill and used within the organization recycling facility to be able to generate energy. If I look at hospitals, just as an example, hospitals are asked to reduce the waste, or basically, reduce waste which could be generated by usage of different types of, let's say material or equipment within the hospital itself. Things like, if you look at clothing, bedding, linen, that is a major waste which comes out of hospitals because it needs to be treated before it can be done away with. And in some cases, if it is stained or it is, not usable, then it has to be done away with in terms of, recycling, or obviously not recycling, but it has to be done away with. That means it has to be safely disposed of as a waste to ensure that infections do not spread. You look at uses of syringes. Now, obviously, we have disposable syringes, but they still have that element of being plastic and some element of that being, metal. So obviously, recycling is essentially, encouraged within hospital, wherein the classification of waste is done and collection of waste is done on the basis of that classification, which allows waste management companies to look at collecting that waste and then recycling it. And then, ensuring that in some cases, if the waste is done away with, then it does not lead to creation of any environmental hazard or infections. And they are aware and trained to be able to dispose of that waste safely. Now, in those cases, you could use that as an example primarily to cover, some part of it with regards to explaining this particular assessment criteria. Is that okay? So any questions on
Yes.
today's discussion? So this helps us cover learning outcome 1 today, which has these 2 assessment criteria. And, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me now.
No, sir.
All right. Okay. So if there are no more questions, we will try and end the session now. Maria, any questions at your end? Any questions at your end, Eunice?
No, please, no.
All right.
No,
Okay.
thank you.
All right. No worries. So we'll catch up tomorrow to discuss learning outcome 2 at 9. And until then, what I would do is basically go through some part of what we've discussed today. And, if you think of any questions or any doubts or queries, then we could start with a bit of a recap tomorrow before we go into learning outcome 2. And I'll be happy to address some of the questions that you have or queries that you have, tomorrow itself. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. And I'll speak to you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Have a nice
Thank you.